everybody. Welcome to the next installment of Statistics in Pajamas. We're going to jump into our next inferential test, another one that's really quite common across all different disciplines, but certainly used within natural resources and environmental science applications, and that would be t-tests, where we're looking to test for the difference between groups. So just to put this in perspective, we've just come from the one sample z-test, where we were trying to take one sample, observations that we'd collected for one sample, to compare that to a larger population and see if there was a difference between our one sample and that population. This time, we're out there collecting two different sets of data for two different groups or two different samples, and we want to see if the means of those two samples differ. This is really common for comparative experiments, or really any kind of experimental design where you have one treatment and a control that you want to compare, or two different treatments that you'd like to compare, or two different groups that differ because of some different scenario or characteristic. And so we really want to know whether or not that treatment, or whether that grouping, however we group it, whether that's making a difference in causing those two different samples, which represent their larger populations, right? Whether that causes them to differ. So we'll continue with this practice of trying to create our own little flowchart of how to identify the correct analysis to run. And we'll start at the top and figure out which type of response data we have. When we're talking about t-tests, we always have a continuous response variable, right? So that could take any value. It could have so many decimal places. And we know that we're trying to find differences between these groups that we're comparing. So we're down here under the difference research question. How many different samples, or groups is another way to think of samples, are we trying to compare? Now we're looking at two different samples or two different groups that we want to compare. Now what makes the t-test really interesting is that we have another level of question that we have to answer here, and that's whether or not the observations between those two groups are independent of each other, or if they are actually dependent on each other. Note that this brings you to a t-test no matter which choice you make here, but if you have independent samples, it's an independent t-test, and if you have samples that are not independent, it's essentially a dependent t-test, or also called matched pairs. And we'll talk a little bit about how to determine whether or not our samples are dependent or independent in a second. But first, let's just go back to the list format. So this is sort of going through the flow chart. If you are preferential to the list, when would you use a t-test? Well, you know you have a continuous response variable, right? And you know that you're looking for differences between two groups, two different samples that you've collected. And it does have some assumptions associated with it, right? Just like our other tests, we know that the data has to be normally distributed to conduct the student's t-test. And also there's an added assumption here that both of those groups have to have approximately equal variance. So in other words, you couldn't have one of those groups that had a standard deviation of 1 and the other group had a standard deviation of 100. If that's the case, it's going to bump us into another non-parametric test. So it's just one more thing to keep in mind when you're testing to see if you meet the assumptions. We can test for normality, but we can also test for equal variance, and I'll show you how to do that and jump as well. But again, we're back to this key question: what type of t-test do I need to run? And it really depends on whether or not my samples are dependent or independent. So let's talk about that for a second. The textbook definition is basically that you know you have two independent samples if the observations that you selected for one of those samples in no way determines or is related to which observations you select in the second sample. Right? So I could go out and I could collect a whole bunch of data from a whole bunch of different people, and which people I chose for that sample in no way affect the second set of people that I choose for the second sample, right? So they are independent of each other. In contrast, we know that two samples are dependent on each other if the observations that I chose for one of those samples inherently means that I have to choose very specific observations for the other set, because I'm trying to link them together and match them up, observation to observation, for the two groups. That might seem a little abstract and confusing, but I think if we put it to some examples, it'll make more sense. Dependent samples are usually pretty obvious because it's very clear how you would pair the observations from one sample to the observations from the other. One perfect example of this is before and after. So maybe you have the exact same actual unit of observation, say a person or a plot, but you measure it once before some treatment, and then you measure that exact same observation a second time after treatment. So that would be an example of dependent. We have to know which value is associated with each observation in the before so we can link it to its pair, right? The after value for the after observation. So that's why these are often referred to as matched pairs, because we're purposely trying to link two observations together, one from the first sample and the other from the second sample. Let's practice. We'll look at each of these and see if we can figure out whether it's independent samples or dependent samples. So imagine at the beginning of the semester, I randomly select 50 students from this class and I give them a test to see their aptitude in statistics. At the end of the semester, I randomly select another 50 students. Could be some of the same students, might not be, but I'm randomly selecting 50 students. I give them a post-test. So I want to compare these random students from the first pretest and 50 random students for the post-test. Would this be an independent or a dependent test? Well, it might be easiest to figure out if you compare it to the other scenario. How about this? What if at the beginning of each semester, I randomly selected 50 students and I gave them a pretest? At the end of the semester, I took those exact same students and I gave them the post-test. Does that make it clearer? Right? So in this case, I have kept the exact same observations, and I know that I have to link each student's pretest to that same exact student's post-test. So I'm really controlling for a lot of other sources of variability, and I'm isolating really the effect of that class because the student stays the same, right? Their math skills stay the same. Their fear of tests stays the same, right? The only thing that really is changing, I hope, is that they have taken this class. And so this, therefore, would be an example of an independent set of samples, right? I've randomly selected the first 50. Which 50 I randomly selected in no way determines what the second set of 50 would be that I select. They're both random. So that would be an independent sample. So before and after, that might be an obvious one, but there are some other possibilities where you would have matched pairs of observations. Imagine you're doing a study of twins. Twin 1 would have to be linked to twin 2. What if you were trying to examine households and how relationships work between husbands and wives? You want to make sure you're pairing each husband to his wife and not some other wife to be able to assess that. There are other examples that aren't quite as obvious. So if, for example, I were selecting trees on the exact same plot, right? So I know that which trees I select is defined by some set boundary, right? So picking one tree, I know that I'm going to be picking all of the other trees within that plot too. And I'm not going to be going outside of that plot. I'm not going to be randomly selecting. So because these are on the same plot, the trees are essentially dependent upon each other, right? They're paired with each other because of that co-location. So I might want to compare how one species is performing on that plot to another species. There's are two different groups that I'm trying to compare, but they are matched to each other because of their co-location. So that would be another dependent sample. Because these are two different tests, they're both t-tests, but they are different tests, we'll start with one at a time.